We're delighted to have you amongst us today, as we say, from Toronto to Tasmania, because we have a bunch of pension fund board members and trustees from various jurisdictions, including the US, Canada, and most of Western Europe, as well as China, Hong Kong, and Australia. So it's a pretty global bunch. And as the Right Honourable Nick Cherry, the co-chair of the conference, is on the way to join us from Australia electronically online, but without further ado, we're starting with that top-line interview with Chairman Scott, because we know that he's right in the middle of an election campaign, a decisive one, so his time is precious. So we don't want to hold him more than necessary. Congressman, we're delighted to have you here today. I know what you have done in the US since you joined Congress, and I'm delighted to have you, especially for your dual or triple, Asia Pacific, African American, and global perspective. It's quite unique, as I told Rob earlier. So we're delighted to have you for that reason also, apart from your progressive and highly progressive and ESG, as we say, ESG friendly, environmental friendly policies that you have championed over the years. And without further ado, once again, as the Right Honourable Nick Cherry joins us from Australia, I will hand the floor to my colleague, Rob Colorina, who will start the interview with Chairman Scott. Rob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm Rob Colorina. I'm a director with AIAC. We're an equity group that's US-based with interests in 24 countries and 20 states. I have the benefit of knowing Congressman Scott for over the last 2 decades. Most notably, we have an investment with jobs in his district in the ship repair area called Craft Machine Works. And I have had the benefit of seeing his leadership in action with both, as Nick mentioned, the diversity community, as well as the various committees that he's on in US Congress. The congressman comes by a short background, comes to us as an alumnus of Harvard College, also has the benefit of experience as being a former state delegate and state senator, which will weave into some of the dialogue here with respect to, and Nick, you mentioned global, but some of the themes that he's going to bring up is in fact local in terms of state and local government, which is very important both domestically as well as abroad. Congressman, also, aside from your service in both Congress, we all here at World Pension Council want to also thank you for your service in the U.S. Army. And that's something that a lot of Virginians are appreciative of military experience, service, and the like. This is going to be a pretty open-ended dialogue. And Congressman, you have the benefit of perspective in your chairmanship in the current Congress of both the of the Congressional Caucus and Committee on Workforce and Education, but also just given the perspective of pensions and this forum of your work with the Committee for Budget. I'm going to kick things off to you, Congressman, if you'd be so kind to share what you want to talk about this morning. As I understand, you're going to kick things off a little bit more towards, at the beginning, towards economic and fiscal stimulus around COVID and the HEROES Act, and we could dive in further from there. So I'm going to turn that to you, Congressman.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rob, and it's certainly a pleasure for me to participate with the Minorities in Restructuring and Alternative Investments and the World Pension Council and Singapore Economic Forum. Thank you for inviting me to speak about the work of the committee I chair, the Committee on Education and Labor, particularly as it relates to COVID-19 pandemic and protecting retirement security. I want to thank all the chairs, the Right Honourable Nick Cherry in Tasmania, as well as the forum co-chairs, Suzanne Bishoprick in New York and David Weeks in London, and of course Nick Fursley, who's with us on screen right now. And I think we were on a program a couple of months ago, I believe, weren't we, Nick? Okay.
Yeah, that was great. That was really great.
All right. And I mentioned, as Rob mentioned, I represent part of the Hampton Roads region of the Commonwealth of Virginia in the House of Representatives. The committee has had a central role in congressional response to COVID-19, because a lot of it has been focusing on education. Students are falling behind when they're forced to shift to remote or hybrid learning. We need to protect the health of students, parents, and staff. State and local governments are facing massive shortfalls that will trigger devastating cuts to public services unless they receive federal support. Millions of Americans are still without work, and those who are employed do not have the full protection that I think they need from the Occupational Health and Safety Administration. We've already lost, it's been a devastating health pandemic because we've lost over 190,000 lives just in the United States alone. Congress passed 4 bipartisan bills that dramatically expanded unemployment insurance, secured the idea that if you are tested for COVID-19, you shouldn't have to pay any copay or deductible. And when we get a vaccine, we shouldn't have to pay a copay or deductible once those are developed. The emergency funding for schools and institutions of higher learning, and additional steps for students, workers, and their families. These have helped keep the economy up and running, but there's more that needs to be done. Those are running out, and we need to do more. The House 4 months ago passed what we call the HEROES Act. And the first thing it did was to give support for state and local governments. Because if we don't give, they have to balance their budgets, unlike the federal government, they have to balance their budgets. So if when they have a shortfall, which is projected state and local about $1 trillion, things have to get cut. Education is one of those, and we expect if we don't do anything, education to be cut about $300 billion. And this is at a time when we know we need to reopen our schools. Academic achievement is better. Supporting students' social and emotional training is better. Nutrition, access to school meals is better. Identifying child abuse and neglect is better. And let's get serious. We're not going to reopen our economy unless we reopen our schools. But the anticipated cuts put the schools in a situation where they won't have the resources to open safely. They need more money for PPEs, disinfectant, more money for transportation because they won't be able to put as many students in a bus. And the Centers for Disease Control has identified ventilation as an essential element. A lot of the schools have dilapidated ventilation systems, so they need money. And so the HEROES Act provided, first of all, enough money so that the state and local governments won't have to do any cuts, and then additional money so that they could have the money for education and for school construction. The school construction was in another bill called the Moving Forward Bill, an infrastructure bill. We also direct OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to develop enforceable workplace standards. All they have right now are voluntary guidelines, unenforceable voluntary guidelines. We need them to have enforceable standards to protect workers against infectious disease. The legislation included a lot of other things, but one of the things that I'm most proud of is it helps workers in their pension situation. A lot of pension funds in America are on the verge of collapse, particularly what we call multi-employer pension funds, where a lot of employers have gotten together to provide employers in areas like construction where they go from employer to employer. They set up an account. A lot of employers participate, but some of these are in financial distress, and our bill gives them the support they need to survive. The cost of it is about $60 billion, but several agencies have looked at it and found that if we let these things go under and millions of people lose their pension, they will pay less income tax. They will be more likely to access social services, and the cost of that is actually significantly more than the $60 billion price tag, and it's getting more expensive as we go on. So the bill protects the multi-employer pension system, which I think is extremely important. We also passed last December what we call the Secure Act. The legislation made it easier for small businesses to band together to offer employees retirement savings plans. We've also been conducting oversight over the Department of Labor and some of their regulations involving retirement savings. Some of those regulations leave a lot to be desired. But as we continue, we look forward to making sure that we can provide quality education, that we help workers secure and retain good paying jobs, and we protect workers' access to a secure and dignified retirement, both during the pandemic and beyond. So Rob, thank you for your introduction again, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Congressman. Could you, I see Suzanne has joined the panel screen here. And Suzanne, I've caught up through the years. Usually this time of year, we catch up around United Nations General Assembly in New York with your role with the United Nations Pension Fund in the past. You know, this is going to be a virtual year for a lot of things. And in the spirit of when you have countries like that coming together and finding compromise, I think, Congressman, the attendees and the host committee here, we'd be interested in your thoughts on sort of this bicameral approach and cooperation amongst the parties in interest there on Capitol Hill and the White House and places. Of how do you all anticipate the attitudes and the cooperation here in the next few weeks and months?
Well, one of the challenges we have is that the Senate has not shown any real urgency to do anything to address the ongoing problems resulting from COVID-19. We passed the HEROES Act about 4 months ago, and they have not come up with a response yet. The school construction money, for example, as I indicated, ventilation is an essential element. The Government Accountability Office did a report a few months ago that showed that 40% of the school districts in the country need to repair or replace their ventilation systems in more than half their schools. Now, ventilation, as I indicated, has been identified by the Centers for Disease Control as an essential element. That's because if you're in an enclosed room, like a lot of school classrooms are, without proper ventilation, you have the situation that explains why you can eat at a restaurant outside but not inside. As people just breathe, the virus gets in the air, and if there's not good ventilation, eventually you'll be breathing the virus and have a problem. If there is good ventilation, you don't have that problem. In schools without proper ventilation, obviously you're just asking for trouble. And so these ventilation systems can't fix themselves overnight. If the money were available this afternoon, it would take them some time to do the repairs. And like I said, this bill passed and other bills passed 4 months ago. There's plenty of time before the school year opened in September to do these repairs, but the Senate is just, to this day, has not been able to pass any bill. They called up a bill a couple of days ago and couldn't even get the votes to have it considered, not voted on, considered. And so the Republican leader has indicated that about a third of his caucus is unwilling to vote for anything. I mean, nothing. No. They think they've already spent too much. And so unless he's willing to work in a bipartisan fashion with the Democrats, there's no way he can put together 50 votes for anything. And he hasn't come to the realization that he's got to work in a bipartisan fashion if anything's going to be done. You get the idea that he's not, he's just not pressed about getting anything done. If nothing gets done, it seems like it won't hurt his feelings. We got the pension problem to deal with. We've got education to deal with, child nutrition. We have a housing crisis where people are about to be evicted from their, millions of people are about to be evicted from their homes. We had a moratorium on evictions, and now it's that's ending. unless you have some rent relief, a moratorium won't help you. That just delays the inevitable. If you can't pay your rent today, you go 2 months without having to pay. At the end of 2 months, you're less likely to be able to pay than you were today.
Yeah.
So unless you can come up with some rental assistance, the renters are going to be in bad shape. And by the way, the landlords are going to be in bad shape, because if the renters aren't paying their rent, the landlords can't pay their mortgages. And if you've got 100 units and half of them aren't paying, you could be in bankruptcy. If you're just a mom and pop with a couple of units, you're depending on that for your retirement, you're in trouble. So we need some rental relief, and that's in the HEROES bill, but there's nothing there. Child nutrition, 17 million children were food insecure in the last few months, and we had a lot of programs that are expiring. So you ask, how do you operate in a bipartisan fashion? The House has acted, the Senate has not, and until the Senate acts. Now, I would expect the governors, Republican governors and Republican mayors, to be passing the word to their Republican senators that they need this money, and there'll be drastic cuts in essential services if the money that's in the HEROES Act isn't forthcoming. And I think that might make the difference.
Well, that Susan had a question, and I think Rob also has one more question. But if you allow me to interject, I had a question for you, Congressman, because people speak of, one of the main themes of the conference today is ESG, which is an ugly acronym which stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's pretty much everything, because it's as you're a policymaker and lawmaker, you well know that if you speak about the environment, social and economic issues, and economic governance, you have pretty much the whole gamut. So people speak a lot about ESG, and we're all saying, Rob, Suzanne, and all of us, that this year is really a turning point. And, as far as Wall Street is concerned, many of these Wall Street tycoons seem to start embracing the ESG agenda, or they act as if they're doing, which is a good start. So ESG is really moving center stage. And for the financial community, so for investors, for financial analysts, sadly, it's a lot about ticking boxes. So, they create these fancy, ESG indices, and they tick boxes like robots, right? In essence, not all of them, but many of them. And I really insist, and I think Suzanne will agree with me, that, ESG is more than that. You need some drive. So if there is, I hate to use the word ideology, but if you don't have a modicum of ideological drive behind it to push the agenda, it will remain a series of boxes that, policymakers and investors and rating agencies will simply tick. And the question I had for you is, you seem to be very much ahead of the curve regarding these issues. And of course, labor and education are key. I mean, they're really at the heart of the ESG agenda. And I saw that your own father was a physician and very much involved in local primary school and high school boards. And he didn't have to, but he spending hours every week pro bono with the local high school. And your mom was a teacher. So I was going to ask you, in your personal drive, today, are you still guided by that upbringing? I mean, having been raised by a doctor, people at the forefront of the healthcare, helping people, saving lives, and a very engaged mother who was a teacher. So do you keep that in the back of your mind every day, and does it still guide you?
Yes, and I think the ESG funds are actually, there's a good argument that can be made. There's a good argument that can be made to show that these are actually safer, because they don't have the investment problems that some of the industries that may be on the way to failure may be having. The Department of Labor, so they're actually good investments, and people ought to have that choice. Incredibly, the Department of, and you need to look, if you're looking at funds, you can look at returns, and the ESG funds do as well, and many times better than general mutual funds. Incredibly, the Department of Labor has passed is in the process of passing or passing regulations that make ESG funds an unacceptable choice for people to choose in their pension funds. That doesn't make any sense. They may decide if you have some that are doing as well as other funds, and you have the idea that they are less risky because they don't carry some of the risk that if climate change initiatives take place, the oil-based stocks may be at risk, and you don't want to take that risk. You want to be very aggressive with climate change initiatives. And so you want those out of your portfolio, tobacco stocks, things like that. And there are a lot of, you want governance, you want you want to be governed by people that are doing a good job. These are favorable things that look towards the future, and you may actually be doing better. But the bottom line is the actual returns are as good as better as other funds. The Department of Labor has put them on the list of unacceptable funds.
It's hard, yeah. It's really hard to believe they did this. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, well, at the same time, they put, I think, private equity funds as acceptable risk. Really? People don't know people don't even know what they are. And so, and then they're limiting for financial advisors their responsibility as a fiduciary. So you get people who are not giving advice in the advisor's best interest, not the investor's best interest, and you get a situation that is just hard to believe. But the ESG funds, I think, are the way, as you suggested, are the wave of the future, because they look really long term at where we are likely to be. And if you've loaded up on oil stocks and we get aggressive on climate change legislation, your investments may not do as well as those who look forward for environmentally friendly stocks, social equity, and good governance.
Congressman, in the spirit of diversity, I'm going to invite Suzanne for gender balance to present her question verbally. So Suzanne, go ahead.
I have to say I'm in total agreement with Representative Scott on his initiatives. What I want to know is how is it possible that the Department of Labor is so liberal with high fee, high risk private equity investments for retail investors, where it almost is impeding ESG investments, which I think are the best solution for long-term investments such as pensions. It seems to be a totally diametrically opposed proposition.
I think that's not a question, but a statement. And you can't. How do you answer something like that? We have submitted comments in opposition to their decisions on ESG funds. We've submitted comments in opposition to their fiduciary rulings. We've submitted comments on using private equity funds and pensions. We have an election in November, so we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
Congressman, later on this morning, we're going to have a panelist from, or maybe two, from the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. Just given and Angela's great people, caught up through the years. From your perspective on education, can you speak a little bit about college towns and the like, because this relates to something you brought up earlier on real estate, but with respect to how you see or recommendations on educational systems, both pre-college and in college, just given the some of the unique characteristics of the integrated economies and communities to these enterprises.
Well, first, one of the priorities of the Committee on Education and Workforce is to make sure people get a good education so they can get a good job. We have figured out that a mere high school diploma is woefully insufficient to access the best paying jobs in the United States. You need some education and training past the high school level, not necessarily a 4-year college liberal arts degree, but some education and training past the high school level. And we're going to make these opportunities available to everybody. Regrettably, right now, the cost of college has just gone through the roof to the point where you have to go into almost mortgage-sized debt in order to get a college education. That really legitimizes a question that many students ask, and that is college worth it? Well, when the Higher Education Act passed in 1965, President Johnson said that, essentially said that this legislation means that any student in any state can apply to any college or university and not be turned away because the family is poor. And you could go to college and come out with a 4-year degree with no debt. If you're willing to work 15 hours a week, you could come out with no debt. You could so-called work your way through college.
Yeah.
That's because the Pell Grant covered about 75% of the cost of going to college. States were paying about 2/3 of the cost of a state college. Now states are paying about 1/3 of the cost of the state college, and the Pell Grant's covering less than 30%. The rest is on the student. And so they're coming out. It's not unusual to have students come out with a 4-year degree with $50,000 or a graduate degree with a 6-figure debt. And some are figuring out that that kind of debt is hard to pay off. And so one of the things we're doing is making it more affordable. The other thing we're doing is making it a little more relevant. A liberal arts degree is nice, but there are a lot of specific job training opportunities where you can develop a skill. So our community college system has courses that are 8, 12, 16 weeks, where they've shown that you can increase your salary 25, 50, or even 100% by taking these courses. You mentioned shipbuilding. There are a lot of courses, a lot of skills in shipbuilding, particularly welding and things like that, where people can get fantastic salaries that are not available not available without a little skills training.
Actually, I had a concluding question for the congressman, because I love like Suzanne said, I agree with everything you say. So it's difficult to ask you a negative question, but I'll try to conclude on that note, a note of hope for the future. And you mentioned shipyards and shipbuilding, and so that's infrastructure. That's critical transportation infrastructure, and even hospitals, public hospitals, and state universities are also a form of social infrastructure or educational infrastructure. And I was going to say, the current president was able 4 years ago to tap into the anger of some of the disenfranchised, lower middle class, blue collar workers in many states by promising that he would invest a lot in infrastructure. And actually Bernie Sanders did the same in the primaries 4 years ago. And I think even as a centrist or as a center-left centrist, I found it quite smart, because all parties, or most congressmen from both parties in the previous 30 years had neglected infrastructure investment to a certain extent. So it was a bipartisan neglect. And of course, he was elected by promising, but he ended up not doing much for infrastructure. But the mere fact of speaking about it was perhaps a starting point. So what I'm coming at in the next Congress or in the next Senate, how people like you, real progressives who care about infrastructure investment, transportations, shipyards, how people like you can really make sure that whoever sits in the White House, they will really, really, really follow up on their promises about infrastructure investment and greening and Green New Deals.
Well, I appreciate you pointing out there's a difference between the rhetoric and reality. He did promise a lot of good paying jobs. He had a stimulus package that cost about $1.9 trillion. The $1.9 trillion, and 80% of the benefits went to the top 1% in corporations. Everybody else kind of got what they say, what fell off the truck. And no infrastructure. The part of our infrastructure bill, the Moving Forward Act, that includes $130 billion in school construction. The $130 billion in school construction will actually produce many times more jobs than the $1.9 trillion tax package that the president passed a couple of years ago. And if you look at the graph of the unemployment rate, if you take the dates from under it, you don't see a wrinkle anywhere in that graph so that you could point to the point where $1.9 trillion was spent. Number of jobs created, the graph is just absolutely flat. There's no indication of where that took place. Now, if you go back for a stimulus package about half as expensive, when President Obama came in office, the unemployment rate was going through the roof. His plan came in, and you could see almost an immediate improvement. Number of jobs, we're losing jobs, hundreds of thousands of jobs every month. You could point to the day his package went into effect, and you could see the improvement after that. But with 1.9 trillion, not a wrinkle in the graph. We need to separate the good promises from reality. There's also just as a partisan, Democrats are accused of fiscal irresponsibility, and Republicans are fiscally responsible. But if you go back 60 years, go back to 50 years to President Kennedy, every Democratic administration has ended with a better deficit situation than it began, everyone without exception. Every Republican administration, without exception, since then, has ended up with a worse deficit situation than they started, without exception. And President Trump was well on the way to fulfilling that pattern even before the pandemic. But still, we get credit. You know, it is what it is, and we need to. I'll take your criticism as constructive criticism. We need to be able to explain ourselves a little better.
Thank you, Chairman.
This is Rob. I guess as we conclude to shift to the next panel, and if you look on the screen here, we have a couple of folks from the good Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, Angela and Chuck. And then also we have Anthony Scaramucci from SALT that you might recognize from some of the Washington circles. And Nick, I hope, Anthony, being a long relation, I hope you address the bicameral approach to things in your next panel. Can you hear us okay, Anthony?
It's a very nice transition.
I can hear you perfectly, yeah. Good morning, everybody.
Okay. And Nick, from Africa, did you look like you were going to chime in? Did you have a quick comment or question? Nick Cherry?
Australia.
Australia. Yep.
We'll bring in Nick Cherry a little later because we're out of time. And I know that the congressman has a campaign, a very active campaign to run. So I want to thank R.O. Colorina. Rob, thank you very much for being here today. Chairman, it was a pleasure to have you live from Washington, D.C. And as we say in French, à bientôt. À très bientôt. Cheers.
Thank you all. Look forward to the dialogue the next couple of days.
Merci. And without further ado, we're bringing in Anthony Scaramucci from New York City, who will give us his own bipartisan, I guess, perspective on the current situation. And I think Anthony wanted to focus on the current sort of macroeconomic, geopolitical, circumstances in the weeks and days preceding the election. Anthony, the floor is yours.
Well, guys, thank you very much for having me on. I guess I want to break it up into three components because you know, it really depends on your opinion of Mr. Trump and where you think the election is going. And so I'm going to be very upfront with everybody. I share my opinions pretty openly on television. This is nothing personal against Mr. Trump. If you just look at the objective standards and objective criteria, and imagine the 7 of us were on a search committee for a publicly traded company. We were the board of a publicly traded company, and we were trying to hire a CEO. And we had 2 people that we could choose from. Those are the only 2 people out of 330 million people that we could choose from. And for whatever reason, we made the decision. And the great irony about this is 3 of us voted for the one person, 4 of us voted against the person, but we still chose that person. And that person goes on to become the CEO. And now you have 3.5 years of objective criteria to look at the person. So my stipulation to everybody is that if you had that situation happen, and then you looked at the person's Twitter account, you looked at their behavior, you looked at the policies, you looked at the magnitude of destruction to the global alliance that was set up after World War II, you looked at the praise of autocrats, and you looked at the deficit spending, and then the piece de resistance, you look at the mishandling of the pandemic, which with great irony actually destroyed the economy. Because if you have 600 million deaths per million in the United States, in the Asian countries, they're at about 20 million deaths. And so we could have totally handled this differently had we adhered to some level of science. So again, just making this stipulation, I would be firing that CEO. It's not to demonize Mr. Trump. It's not to say anything that distorts reality. He's a human being like all the rest of us. There are good qualities to him. There are bad qualities to him. But I would be firing the guy. But we now have an election 7 weeks from today. I don't know if he's getting fired or not. The polling data that I see is very, very close. Nate Silver says 75% chance that the vice president wins that election. I think Nate Silver is going to be right because we've done something through the alienation process. Mr. Trump has alienated so many people as there's a very large group of Republicans, including myself, that are galvanizing to help the vice president. And so whatever you think of Steve Bannon, I have my own personal opinion of Steve, but whatever you think of him, if he's right, and I believe he is, 3 to 5% of the Republicans migrate over to the vice president or don't vote, the vice president will win the election. So this is a very binary thing. If the vice president wins, then I would tell you he's got to reverse a lot of the things that have happened. He's got to start applying more science to the pandemic. But then I think we need to focus on 3 major things. And if we don't focus on these 3 major things, the United States, which is this amazing country, great natural resources, and ultimately it's a resilient country and will do quite well, but we'll continue to have this dilemma of wealth dispersion in the U.S. And so what are those 3 things? It's infrastructure spending. We have to spend the money on infrastructure, and we have to rebuild these bridges, roads, and tunnels, these airports, these schools, if you will. And we can have a debate about deficit spending, but I would stipulate, and I can explain it to people, that deficit spending that's spent on infrastructure creates economic rent, social good, and has way more benefits, and it's worth the deficit spending. As an example, if you looked at the Big Dig in Boston, it was supposed to cost about $3 billion. Through the corruption, graft, and delays, it ended up costing $21 billion, a staggeringly colossal amount of money. But if you step back and you look at the field studies on that infrastructure spend, you had close to $400 billion of positive externalities to the city of Boston. It is a sort of an amazing story there. They've created 7 new suburban areas. Real estate prices have gone up. The gentrification, people don't like using that word, is been massive. And so time to the airport's been cut down. Time to go out to the outer suburbs has been cut down. And this is just an example of, even though it was 4 or 5 times the cost of what they had expected, they ended up getting these massive externalities. If you go back to the 1969 moon launch, as an example, we spent approximately $25 billion in the 60s to get Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. That's about $400 billion of today's money. Yet if you step back and look at the positive externalities to science and technology, the evolution of the internet through DARPA, the geo-positioning of satellites, rocket technology, the expansion of the internet globally. I mean, we could go on and on and on. It wasn't just Velcro and Post-it notes and Tang and aluminum foil. It was a tremendous unleashing of economic and scientific innovation. So,
Anthony, I'm glad you focused on infrastructure. It's great. If you had to wrap up your next two arguments or your next two issues in 2 minutes, go ahead.
Yes, yeah, and so the next two arguments are education. We have to right size and even up the K through 12 educational system. You're not going to be able to do it with charter schools. You have to figure out a way to work with the public school system and the teachers union, because that's really where all the kids are being taught. And we have to figure out a way to reinvigorate that. The system is uneven. I would argue that the Common Core introduction 15 years ago has more or less failed. And we don't have the time to go into that, but that is another big piece of this. And then the last piece, which I also think is equally important to the other two, is we have to have an industrial policy in the United States. And I'll say one last thing, and then I'll conclude my remarks, is that the United States, with all of its brilliance, all this great entrepreneurship, all this technology innovation, we don't have political leaders that have 10-year plans or 15-year plans. We did have them. We had them after the World War. We had an industrial policy plan. We had a plan to get to the moon. We had a plan to contain communism. But today, our political leaders are fighting it out on cable news in 2-minute news cycles, in 2, 4, or 6-year election cycles. But nobody has a 10-year plan. If you look at the Chinese obviously have 50 and 100-year plans. You can just look at their plan for 2049, the 100th anniversary of their, since their revolution, and they have a very detailed plan. And so my last piece of my argument is we got to clean out Mr. Trump, and we have to have a transformative post-partisan process in the United States. I know that sounds impossible, but I think with the right leadership at the top, I think it could work.
Thank you, Anthony.